We're so glad you're here. Whether you're joining us for the first time or this is your annual tradition with us, we are so thrilled you're part of it, part of the excitement.
There we go.
So,
okay, and let's see who's with us today. Let us know. Here we go. Karen in Northern California.
Hey,
Kevin is asking, how come he doesn't have a wig? I got a hat.
here's a hat.
Belle says, Hag Purim Sameach. Here we go. Okay. Is Pena Regatta somebody's name on your show?
Oh, this is actually our grogger for today. So those who may be new to the Megilla experience, when we say the name of the bad guy, the evil, wicked villain in the story, Haman, we make noise and boo. We may not do it every single one. It really can slow down the proceedings a lot.
Yes.
But this, I don't actually have a grogger, which is this little noisemaker, but this works pretty well.
Yes. Okay, and just to reiterate, over there on the YouTube and Facebook side, there's no donate button on Facebook today, just some kind of glitch. But we've got the donate link in the comments. You could just go through our website. The point is that all donations to our nonprofit, so they're tax deductible, but today they go straight to the poor. Okay, so it's for you to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment of Matanos Levionim, to give gifts to the needy on Purim. Okay, now what I'm not going to be able to do, unless I do this, hold on a second, is see when those gifts come in. So we're not going to make announcements of donations. Yeah.
We're a little bit late already, so
Yeah.
I think we
This is
should
the other
probably just
computer.
gonna get started.
That's okay. I mean, maybe.
But then you'd have to turn to that. Yeah.
Maybe. Maybe I'll be able to do it. We'll see. A little verklempt, but that's Purim. Everything's a little topsy-turvy.
But it a little bit interrupts the flow, so maybe
Okay.
just, yeah.
All right. Here we go. And a few other people checking in. Paul is happy to be with us. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Sharon and Ken. Wonderful. Welcome.
Yay.
Gisette says Hag Purim Sameach. Sam Richardson checking in, Linda Feldman, Diane Rodriguez, who is Pastor Diane from Portland, Oregon, wishing us Hag Sameach to you, and Rosie, and Tirza, Hag Purim Sameach to everybody over there on the YouTube side. Yisrael says, I was nervous I was missed this show. We were a little late. We had technical difficulties getting that Facebook donate button to find out it wasn't working. It's there.
You did? Okay,
it's
cool.
there. It's there. It's easy to remember. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and all gifts today go to the needy. Okay. Aoife checking in. Purim Sameach. Lynn in North Texas. Marie is with us, wishing us a happy Purim. Ella, Marjorie, everyone is here.
A lot of familiar
Thank
names.
God. Okay.
And we're thrilled to have the community with us.
Good. All right. So let us do this.
Let's do this.
Everybody
Don't you
ready?
Have the l'chaim, traditional.
Sure, let's have our traditional l'chaim. The little Blanton's bourbon. It's one of our favorites.
Sal's favorite.
Okay. So they say that one is obligated to become so intoxicated on Purim that he doesn't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Now the sages argue, what does that really mean? Are you really supposed to get roaring
And
drunk?
we went to a 9:30 a.m. Megillah reading. Like, what time do you have to wake up to get that trash before?
Oh, no, yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's not in the Megillah reading. It's in a song that they used to sing.
Oh, like a Purim spiel.
Right, but some just say it means you get a little sleepy. There's a whole beautiful
Right.
teaching.
If you're sound asleep, you definitely do not know the difference.
And there's a whole beautiful teaching based on the famous story of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera in the Talmud. You find that in Tractate Megillah on page 7b. That they spent Purim together. And I'm not going to go into the whole story right now. But basically the teaching that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gets out of that story is that you have to know yourself. How do you tolerate alcohol? How do you tolerate intoxication? Are you doing it for a holy purpose? And you have to fine-tune not just your intoxication on Purim, but really your whole life should be fine-tuned so that knowing who you are, what your limitations are, what your gifts are, that you are being of maximum service to the Lord and to your community. That's a beautiful teaching. Let's drink to that. L'chaim, my holy sisters and brothers. L'chaim, Nina. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Shakol niyeh b'diburo.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Shakol niyeh b'diburo.
Amen. All right. We are reading the Megillah. We're going to be doing it in English.
So
this does not satisfy anyone's obligation.
If you're Jewish and you have not, just got to digest that. If you're Jewish and you have not yet heard a public Megillah reading, and there's an opportunity for you to do so, turn off your computer and go do that, because it is an obligation, ideally, if you can.
If possible. Now,
right.
If it's not possible, then the next best thing...
I would say this is better than nothing.
It is absolutely better than nothing. And definitely you want to spend some time today, and we'll try to do it. I mean, we're going to read it in English. We'll make some commentary along the way. But you really want to learn, right? You want to study and learn the Megillah. It's the book of Esther. It's a very important book of the Bible. And it's an incredible story, and there's so many lessons to be learned in this story. And it's a very interesting one because God's name is never mentioned in all these events, but the sort of hidden hand of the Lord is present in all of them. So many crazy coincidences. This is an absolutely true story. Take it from us. Take it as a matter of faith. But that all of this happened was really incredible. And as you read it, don't think about it this kind of exaggerated, crazy events and weird people from the distant past. I mean, really think about that. Persia at that time was the world superpower. This was the most powerful empire that the world had ever known. It extended what they considered globally, 127 regions.
So I guess it was like the Greek Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Roman Empire, and then the Persian Empire? Or that was before the Roman? It was before.
I mean, your order's a little off.
Egypt
first.
At its time, it was the most powerful.
Then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And then the Persians never really went away. But it was at that time, certainly at this time, it was the mightiest empire on earth. Very interesting factoid about them is that part of their power was their communication system. They had the most high-tech, advanced communication system the world had ever known. Basically a kind of early version of the Pony Express. It's actually mentioned in the Megillah, these like fast mules that they were able to communicate from one end of the empire, like a system of mules, and horses. But the point is they had like stables every certain, 20, 30, 40 miles. And the horses would run. There'd be a fresh horse waiting. The messages would go out. There'd be translators to get the messages into every language of the regions covered by the Persian Empire. And they shrunk the message time by a huge factor, right? So prior to this, to get a message, to the other end of the Persian Empire would take 6 months, and they turned it into 6 weeks. It was just an incredible thing. And you'll see that communication system plays a vital role in this story. So really, yes, dear?
I'm just saying.
Just imagine that this is happening in the halls of government of a high-tech, modern society.
So I just wanted to jump in and say that I'm so excited we're reading it in English, because attending the 2 Hebrew language ones, which is fulfilling the obligation. So I did not grow up celebrating Purim, come from a very assimilated Jewish family. My Hebrew reading skills are pretty primitive. I mean, I can read Hebrew, but I do it slowly. So when I'm listening to a public reading of the Megillah, it's very hard for me to follow along. I'm really trying to, each syllable at a time. And sometimes I would lose track. And so I basically cheat by looking a little bit further down on the page for a certain word, Hashverosh or Esther or something, and then I just kind of wait till the reading gets to that point, and then I pick up, and the whole cycle begins again. So it is refreshing to be able to read it in a language that I actually understand.
There we go. And by the way, a big Yasher Koach, a big may you be strengthened, and Mazel Tov to people who've already made gifts to the poor, donating. Renee
thank you,
donated.
Renee.
Purim gifts to the poor. Isabella donated.
Thank you,
Eric
Isabella.
Duchess
Thank
donated.
you, Eric.
And Janice Beanstalk. So
Thank
you can
you so
donate
much,
gifts to
Janice.
the poor today at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All right, let's get into it. Our annual reading of the Megillah. When you read this in Hebrew, you say several blessings before you read it. We've already fulfilled our obligation in Hebrew. I don't know that you say blessings when you read it in English, so we're just going to get right into it. All right, you want to start, honey?
Sure.
Chapter 1, here you go.
So these chapters have names in the English version. The first feast, there's many feasts to come. It happened in the days of Ahasuerus. He was the same Ahasuerus who ruled from India to Kush, 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which is in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all of his ministers and servants, the army of Persia and Media, the governors and the ministers of the provinces in his presence, when he displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the splendorous beauty of his majesty. He made the feast for many days, 180 days. Yes, that's what I said. 180-day party.
They knew how to party.
You would think by day, 178, you'd think they'd be a little worn out, but nope, they were committed to the party. And when those days were completed, the king made a 7-day feast. The after party was another week for all the people in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the smallest, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's orchard. He draped white, green, and blue cloths. Oh, that's why I'm wearing blue. Embroidered with threads of linen and purple wool over silver columns and marble pillars for the guests to sit on. Silver columns and marble pillars for the guests to sit on. I want to be invited to a party like this. He arranged gold and silver divans, I guess like sofas, for the guests to recline on during the feast, on a floor of various precious stones, bahat and shesh, dar and shacharet. He instructed his butlers to pour with golden vessels, and there were vessels of different kinds, and there was royal wine in abundance, as befitting a king. The drinking was appropriate, without coercion. They weren't pouring it down people's throats. For so had the king established, ordering all the stewards of his household to do in accordance with the desire of each and every man. Am I missing a page?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think you are.
I think maybe.
For each and every man.
Do you want to start here, or should we do a whole chapter each?
Let's do chapter 1.
Okay. Vashti's refusal. Queen Vashti made a feast for the women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Biseder, Harvona, Bigta, Avagta, Zetar, and Tarkas, the 7 chamberlains who attended King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king adorned with the royal crown, adorned with only the royal crown, to show the nations and ministers her beauty, for she was of beautiful appearance. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's bidding brought by the chamberlains. So if you're the queen and you're married to the king of the Persian emperor, you don't say no. But Queen Vashti refused to come, and the king grew furious, and his wrath seethed within him. The king spoke to his sages, those knowledgeable of the times, for this was the king's custom. He had advisors, to bring all judicial questions before those who were versed in every law and statute. If you ever want to jump in with a comment, feel free.
Will do.
Those close to him, so that he could present his questions to them, were Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan. These were the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the king and ranked highest in the kingdom. He said to them, by law, what should be done with Queen Vashti for failing to obey the order of King Ahasuerus brought by the chamberlains? Now, I read somewhere that he actually didn't want to kill her. She was hot, she was his wife, she disobeyed him, but he was a little bit looking for an out, because why did he ask her what should be done with Queen Vashti? Clearly, anybody that disobeys the king, executed on the spot. So he knew that. So he was hoping his advisors would actually find a way for him to punish her without killing her. Wanted to get out of the situation, meaning that he really wasn't that strong of a leader. What should be done?
He wasn't that strong of a leader, and these guys who were supposed to have the king's back, as it were, right, his closest advisors, what did they do? They're going to seize on this opportunity. I mean, we have a tradition that says when the king asked the empress Vashti, who was so beautiful, to come out wearing her royal crown, what that meant was he told her to come out wearing only the crown. and that she would be displayed in the nude for his friends. So it's not so surprising that she refused. And there was all this drinking going on. This was part of, these lewd activities. And so you would hope that the advisors would say, listen, okay, she doesn't want to come in, we'll figure out what to do about her tomorrow. What do they do instead? They seize this opportunity to elevate themselves and enhance their own power, not only, in the palace, but even within their own homes, by making an example of this disobedient woman, and that all the women in the empire would learn that this is a patriarchal place, and the women who disobey their husbands are going to suffer the same fate as Vashti. I mean, these were the worst advisors that a king could possibly have.
That's one interpretation. I read another interpretation. It's actually not about the advisors. It was such a patriarchal society that was enshrined in law that when a wife disobeys her husband, certainly if the wife of the king disobeys, like, it wasn't even like the advisors could do much. The law said she had to be put to death. Okay. Memucan declared before the king and his ministers, it is not only against the king that Queen Vashti has sinned.
Memucan is Haman. This is another name for Haman.
So when she refused a king, it wasn't just him that she was disrespecting. It was against all the ministers and all the nations and all the provinces of a king Ahasuerus. For word of the queen's act of belittling the king will reach all the women. So now here's where the advisors are doing him wrong. Maybe there was a certain punishment that was necessary for Vashti legally, but now he's really laying it on thick. For word of the queen's act of belittling the king will reach all the women, causing them to also belittle their husbands in their eyes. So now he's making the king kind of doubt himself. He's feeding the king's insecurity.
Of course, and saying to him, you're not going to be man enough to control your wife. What kind of king are you? You have to do this. And put him on the spot. We had no choice. So
King Ahasuerus was an interesting combination of all-powerful, but yet kind of weak. For they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded that Queen Vashti be brought before him, yet she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's deed will repeat it to all the king's nobles, causing much disgrace and anger. If it please the king, let a royal edict issue from him, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, a new law, and let it not be revoked, that Vashti did not appear in front of King Ahasuerus, and let the king confer her royal title upon another woman who is better than she, looking for a new queen. And the king's decree...
And imagine, right, if you're these advisors of the king, for all we know, Vashti was a very influential queen. So in getting rid of the queen on this pretext that at a drunken party she didn't come out naked and therefore she's disobedient and has to be deposed, what you've really done as one of the king's advisors is remove the most influential person in his sphere, leaving a power gap that they could slip into.
Power vacuum. Right, the queen is pretty powerful, so now they've left that wide open. And look who steps into it. And the king's decree about what he will do to Vashti shall be heard throughout his kingdom, for it is great, and all the women will give respect to their husbands, from the greatest to the smallest. So this was pretty much the definition of a patriarchal society. The idea pleased the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan advised. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its script, so they had various different languages, and to each nation in its language, saying that every man shall be master in his home, and that he speak the language of his nation. So that's something what does that have to do with it?
Well, that's that communication system.
His nation.
But that's that same communication system that all these royal edicts would be distributed throughout the whole empire to each in the language of his nation, right? And what they're emphasizing is, and each can speak his own language in his nation and in his house, because we are such a modern liberal society. Not liberal, but a modern, advanced society, unlike previous empires who would move people around and make them change their language and lose their backgrounds. Ahasuerus' system was bragging that we let our subjects be our subjects and retain their identity. One more thing, Vashti, we have a note here, was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, right? The Babylonian king who had destroyed the first temple, caused the exile of the Jews from Israel, that resulted in Mordecai, the head of the Sanhedrin, not living in Jerusalem, but ending up in the Persian capital in Shushan. So this Vashti wasn't just a beautiful woman who happened to be married to the emperor. She was of the most powerful family. I mean, okay, the Persians had beat the Babylonians, but they remained a force.
She wasn't just some schnook from nowhere.
She wasn't some schnook from nowhere. So to remove somebody who was so experienced in statecraft, for sure left a power vacuum that Haman expected to step into.
I wonder if the language that they spoke is related to Farsi, modern Farsi, which is what they speak in Iran, which of course is Persia.
I do not know. Now we're on chapter 2, and I'll just note that a big yasher koach to Sam Richardson, who donated and sent gifts to the poor through our donate link today. If you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Matanos Levionim, sending gifts to the needy, all donations today to our nonprofit will flow through us to the needy. Okay, here we go. Chapter 2. After these events, when King Achashverosh's wrath had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed upon her. So the king's attendants advised, let virgin maidens of beautiful appearance be sought for the king. You could see this, right? Again, see it actually happen. Imagine. Right, he regretted, of course he regretted that when he was drunk, they advised him to get rid of her, and then he wrote it into law, and they had to get rid of her, and he's like, what are you guys doing? And they said, listen, don't worry about it, King Achashverosh, we're going to get you a new, younger, better model, she'll be amazing, don't let this bother you for a second. And they had to say that, lest the king remember why he got rid of a king that maybe he loved and depended on, a queen that he loved and depended on, was because of the advice of these advisors, right?
They should have found a way for him. Although if they had the whole story.
Exactly. This was the hidden hand of the Lord working to make arrangements for things. And by the way, you'll notice how pivotal, how important wine is in these events. The pivotal events, the deposing of Vashti, the coronation of Esther, and the fall of Haman all take place at wine feasts, and that's one of the reasons why we make l'chaims today. Okay, so the king's attendants advised, let virgin maidens of beautiful appearance be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every virgin maiden of beautiful appearance to Shushan the capital, to the harem, under the charge of Hege, chamberlain of the king, custodian of the women, and let their cosmetic lotions be provided, and let the maiden who finds favor in the king's eyes become queen in Vashti's stead. And the plan pleased the king, and he enacted it. Now there was a Judean man in Shushan the capital, and his name was Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish.
So he was basically an Israeli, right? a tough Israeli. If you've ever met an Israeli, they're pretty tough. And smart, and he was in exile.
Right, and I want to make a note now, so in case I forget later, that this is a teaching I learned this year from my rabbi, from Rav Yekusiel Kalmanson. Mordechai, he's just been introduced into the story, but by the end of these events, you realize that he's really one of the most influential men in history. Okay, wow. He's probably the most powerful and influential, certainly Jewish man, a Jewish person in history. I mean, you could say Moses is more influential to the Jews. You could say Joseph was incredibly influential in the kingdom of Egypt.
Yeah.
And King Solomon's power extended way beyond the borders of Israel.
But in that illustrious small group, in that club, is Mordechai.
And he was probably wealthier than any of them, even than Solomon.
Really?
Because he ended up taking Haman's estate, becoming the number 2 guy, and really the de facto administrator of the entire Persian Empire. Which back then it wasn't even called corruption. Like if you were high level government, you were super rich. Like that's just the way that it worked. Right. And he was the number 2 guy of the biggest empire the world had ever known. A little bit
like Joseph, the number 2 guy.
Definitely a little bit like Joseph, but unlike Joseph,
he was behind the throne.
He was the power behind the throne. But he was also, in addition to being that powerful and that wealthy, he was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Gadol Da'or. He was the head teacher of Torah of the Jewish people.
Was what, like the Jewish court, like
the Sanhedrin was the Jewish court that met in the chamber of hewn stone in the Temple Mount, and when the temple was standing. So how
did you get that role? Were you elected? Were you appointed?
You were the most learned, most respected. All the sages looked to you and made you the head of the Sanhedrin.
And Mordecai was that.
And Mordecai was that. So he was not just rich and powerful. He was the most, and because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, he spoke 70 languages. That was a requirement for members of the Sanhedrin. And as we'll see at the very end of the Megillah, when the Megillah sums up what we should remember Mordecai
Spoiler
for.
Alert.
Spoiler alert. Was of all the many accomplishments that he had, his greatest was that he got along with his family members. He got along with his children.
As we know,
as you can imagine, there's a lot of billionaires that their relationships with their children maybe are a little strained, but he always had good relationships with his children.
It's important mentioning because he was so important, and who knows how much time he had with his kids.
Exactly. He made time for his kids. Very good. Okay, so let's keep reading. So now we just introduced Mordecai. And we just said, so there was a Judean man in Shushan, the capital, and his name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish. That's his lineage. And he was a Benjamite.
So from the tribe of Benjamin.
From the tribe of Benjamin, so descendant of Rachel and Jacob. So he had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been exiled, along with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Vashti's grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had sent into exile. Now, Mordecai had raised Hadassah. She is Esther, same woman, same name, two different names for her, Hadassah or Esther. And she was the daughter of his uncle. Sounds like his first cousin. For she had neither father nor mother. Now, the maiden had beautiful features and a lovely complexion. And after her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as a daughter. And it happened that when the king's order and edict became known, and many maidens were gathered to Shushan, the capital, under the charge of Haggai, Esther was taken, right? The most beautiful women in the capital were taken from their homes.
Plucked away from their
This
family.
is absolutely, trafficking, in women. They had no choice.
Yeah, they had no choice.
And it was sexual trafficking for sure. They're all going to get one night with the emperor. So Esther was taken to the palace under the charge of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the maiden found favor in his eyes, the custodian's eyes, and she won his kindness. So he rushed in a way that he didn't for the other women to provide her with cosmetic lotions and meals, as well as the 7 maidens from the king's palace to attend to her, which she was entitled to be provided with as a member of the harem. Now he treated her and her maidens, right, her attendants, differently, pampering them in the harem.
So she was just a regular harem member, but then she got kind of
She was like Joseph. Like when she was put in this, sort of gilded prison, like Joseph was sent to the prison of the chamberlain of the butchers in Egypt, she found favor in the eyes of the warden. So Esther did not divulge her race or ancestry as a Jewish woman, since Mordecai had instructed her not to divulge it. And every day Mordecai would stroll in front of the harem courtyard to find out how Esther was faring and what would be done with her. And when each maiden's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus, after undergoing the prescribed 12-month care for women, for only then would their period of beauty care be completed, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetic lotions, with which the maiden would appear before the king, she would be provided with whatever entertainment and music she requested to accompany her from the house of the women to the palace. In the evening, she would go to the king, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem under the charge of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, the custodian of the concubines. Right? There was the custodian of the maidens prior to their night with the emperor, and then the custodian of the concubines after their night with the emperor. And she would not go, any of these women, she would not go to the king again unless the king desired her, whereupon she would be summoned by name. And when the time came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, who was the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as a daughter, right? Mordecai had adopted her, to go to the king. When it was her turn to go to the king, she did not request anything other than what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, custodian of the women, would advise. She's like, okay, she was smart enough to ask the guy who sees everything, all these harem women coming and going.
So Haggai is a male or a female? Oh.
I think he's a man.
Oh.
Esther found favor in the eyes of all who beheld her.
Probably eunuch.
Probably.
Yeah.
Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. By the way, the events of Purim, you might think, like, how much time did they take over? Did they happen over?
Well, the party itself was half a year.
It was half a year, and that was a celebrating that the king had started his rule. Yeah. Right? So I don't know if that was in the first year of his rule or the third, but now we're in the 7th year. So at least 4 years have gone by.
Oh, wow.
That she was trapped in that harem, for that long.
Oh.
Okay. So it was in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, the 7th year of his reign. Now the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his favor and kindness more than all the virgins. And he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's stead. The king made a grand feast for all his ministers and servants, and he called it the Feast of Esther. And he offered a tax relief for the provinces and gave presents befitting a king.
To celebrate the new queen, you mean?
To celebrate the new queen. Now, when the virgins were gathered a second time and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Esther would not divulge her ancestry or race as Mordecai had instructed her, and Esther followed Mordecai's instructions just as she had done while under his direct care.
So Mordecai is kind of hovering right outside.
And telling her how to handle herself because he was so experienced in statecraft as the head of the Sanhedrin who had seen a kingdom fall. He had a lot of good advice to give. Mm-hmm. Now, in those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, right, meaning right outside the palace, in a place where VIPs can go and others can't.
Right, not just anybody can
Not just
go
anyone
sit
can
by
sit
the
at the king's gate.
Okay, so interesting. So he was already
he was an illustrious, important person, of course.
So even in exile, you're saying he got some respect.
Right, and later when we're reading the Talmud every day in AT Daily, and we often talk about sages named someone like Mar Ukva, right, who was not only a sage, but he was the head of the Jewish community in Bavel, which became Persia, right? So it's called the Babylonian Talmud, just the region that it's in, but it was under the Persian Empire.
So now, in our story, there is after the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians.
Yes, and then the Talmud was 500 years after that.
Okay.
Right. But the point is that someone like Mar Ukva was the head of the Jewish community in exile, right? And similarly, Mordecai was the exilarch. He was the head of the Jewish community now in exile.
Oh, is that what exilarch means?
Yeah. And
Never knew what that word meant.
And this was the exile between the temples, as opposed to when we're talking about in the Talmud, the exile after the fall of the Second Temple.
Got it.
Okay. So in those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards, became angry and sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And the matter became known to Mordecai because they were speaking in their own language, which they assumed no one in the capital of Shushan could understand. But Mordecai, because he was a member of the Sanhedrin and spoke 70 languages, overheard what they were saying. The matter became known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther. Esther informed the king of it in Mordecai's name. And the matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two were hanged on the gallows. And this favor that Mordecai did for the king was recorded in the book of Chronicles before the king. So concludes chapter 2. Nina will take over. I'll just mention a big Yasher Koach to Arthur Vinitsky, who made a donation to the poor through the link, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All donations today go to the needy. And also Sandy McMurray made a donation.
Sandy.
Yasher Koach.
Woo!
Okay, here's Nina taking over at chapter 3.
Okay, chapter 3, titled Haman is Promoted. Well, wait a second, I gotta get my box of pasta ready. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, and raised him up, and he placed his seat above all his fellow ministers. So this guy is the man, okay? He's the top dog below the king. All the king's servants at the king's gate kneeled and bowed to Haman. Woo! For so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow. That's what started off the whole thing. A Jew doesn't bow down. A Jew bows down only to God.
And we have a tradition that, lest you think, like, for instance, I used to do Taekwondo. Can you make a polite bow, with a fellow
in Asian
competitor?
Culture, it's a different kind of bow.
That's a different kind of bow. Mm-hmm. But in the case of Haman, because he really was so egoistical and, needing people to validate his own insecurity, he had an idol of, one of their local deities, incorporated into his, minister's garb. Oh. Right? Like a royal minister, like as one of the advisors to the king. And so whenever they saw this, this idol, this one of their gods, people would, of course, always bow to that idol. And since the idol was on his chest, they would bow to Haman. So whether they were bowing, obsequiously to him or to the idol didn't matter to him as long as they were obsequious to him. Mm. Of course, Mordecai would never commit avodah zarah, idolatry, by bowing down to an idol. And that idol on Haman's chest made it impossible for Mordecai to bow to him.
The king's servants at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" It happened that when they had said this to him day after day, and he did not listen, so every single day they're saying, "Why aren't you bowing?" They told Haman to see if Mordecai's words would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Haman saw that Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow to him, and Haman was filled with wrath. He just couldn't take it. Everybody in the whole kingdom was bowing down to him, but he was focused on that one guy. He disdained the thought of killing only Mordecai. So that's interesting. So he hated Mordecai. Just take the guy out, right? He had the power to do that, but that wasn't enough for him. For they had informed him of Mordecai's nationality. Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. In the first month, which you see, like Jew hatred, then or now, it's not really rational. Like, I can understand, okay, the guy's disrespectful, you have the right to execute him, but you have to extrapolate to his whole entire people? That's how they think. Which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign. A pur, which is a lot, kind of like a lottery, was cast before Haman for every day and every month, and it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The evil decree. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is one nation scattered and dispersed among the nations, as we are now, throughout the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are unlike those of any other nation. We have our own set of laws. They do not observe the king's laws." So I take exception to that characterization, because one of the laws that we Jews follow is to follow the law of the land. So that was a slander, in my opinion, libel. And it is not in the king's interest, says Haman, to tolerate them. If it please the king, let an edict...
So this is the oldest story there is, right? Jew hatred will always fasten on some justification for itself. And one of the most typical arguments that Jew haters give, so why people should hate Jews, is because they have their own laws, they don't assimilate, dual loyalty, right? You can't trust them because they're going to be loyal to themselves, their own principles, not the land that they live in. And yet, who had the king's back and saved him from an assassination plot when at that time Mordecai had nothing to gain from it? It was just the right thing to do. That was the Jewish man. And who was undermining the queen's authority and forcing the king to lose his queen and trying to build himself up? The guy making the argument about you can't trust the Jews.
You would think. So if the king had been assassinated, that would not have been good for Haman. No. You'd think he would be thankful, right? For Mordecai, who preserved the regime that he had so much power under. So Haman says, "Let an edict be written and sent to the nobles of the provinces that they be destroyed. And I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents," I guess that's their money, their currency, "through the king's functionaries to be deposited in the king's treasuries." So that money is what? For the cost of the concentration camps, you know what I mean? It's buying all the swords and...
The cost of killing an entire nation within a nation.
Right. The king removed his signet ring
For
from
that
his
he had
hand
money.
and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, and the nation is yours to do with as you please." The king's scribes were summoned during the first month of the year, Nisan, on its 13th day, and all that Haman had commanded to the king's satraps. That's a weird word that you only find here. Satrap. And the governors of each province, and to the nobles of each nation was written, to each province according to its script, and each nation according to its language. It was written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent with couriers to all the provinces of the king to annihilate, murder, and destroy all the Jews from young to old, children and women, on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month of the year, which is the month of Adar,
when we fasted.
and to plunder their possessions. The message of the letter was that the law be proclaimed in every province, clearly to all the nations. So this is just overt. He's not trying to hide it. He's not trying to twist into something else. He's like, okay, this is a law. Everybody's got to, get your weapon and kill these people. That they should be ready for that day. The couriers, so that's what you were talking about,
Yes.
like the Pony Express. Oh, so interesting. So that's how they had the capacity to kill so many people, was they had a communication system.
Right.
The couriers hurried out by order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital. The king and Haman sat down to drink, of course, like that's pretty much all the king does. And the city of Shushan was in turmoil.
Some translate the city was bewildered, right? Because
Okay.
the Jews were such an important part of society, and suddenly they're all going to be annihilated.
Right, and
in
another
one day.
point with the people that want to annihilate the Jews, whether it was then, whether it was in Spain, whether in Germany, we're not committing crimes, most of us, kind of a group of people that tends to be productive citizens. So again, it's not rational. It's hatred.
Of course.
Hatred isn't usually rational.
Of course. Chapter 4. And a reminder, if you want to make gifts to the poor today through us, use the link donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All donations
Everything that
today
comes in is
go
not
the
going
needy.
to our nonprofit. It is going straight to
The needy.
organizations.
But you
that
get the
people-
tax benefit anyway. Okay. Mordecai asked Esther to intervene. Chapter 4. Mordecai knew all that had occurred. Mordecai tore his clothes and donned sackcloth and ash. He went out into the city and cried out with a great and bitter cry. He went up until the king's gate, for it is not proper to enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the order of the king reached via the couriers and his law was proclaimed, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and crying and wailing. Sackcloth and ash were spread out for the masses. Esther's maids and chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was terribly afraid. And she sent garments with which to dress Mordecai and to remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he did not accept them. And Esther summoned Hattach, one of the king's chamberlains that he had placed in her service, and she commanded him to go to Mordecai and find out what this was and what this was for. And Hattach went out to Mordecai.
Well, she didn't even know what was going on.
Because she was in
She
her
was in the bubble.
golden jail, right? And Hattach went out to Mordecai to the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the meaning of the money that Haman promised to weigh out into the king's treasuries for the right to destroy the Jews. And he also gave him the message of the edict that was proclaimed in Shushan, calling for their annihilation. And to show it to Esther and to tell her about it and to instruct her, says Mordecai, instruct her to go to the king, to beseech him and plead with him on behalf of her nation. So Hattach went and relayed the words of Mordecai to Esther. And Esther spoke to Hattach, commanding him to relay to Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the king and enters the inner courtyard without being summoned, his is but one verdict: execution.
Off with his head.
And the only exception is the person to whom the king extends his golden scepter, he may live. And I have not, and says Esther, and I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days now. They relayed Esther's words to Mordecai. And Mordecai sent to respond to Esther. And this is a very famous quote from the book of Esther and throughout Jewish scripture and the tradition.
Language. An important lesson.
A very important lesson, and one we all must remember any time that we find ourselves in a situation where we and only we can do the necessary good thing. Says Mordecai to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that you will find refuge in the king's palace, because you're the queen, and thus be saved from among all the Jews, your people. For if you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will arise for the Jews from another source." After all, we have a covenant with the Lord.
Yeah.
"And you and the house of your father will be lost. And who knows if at about this time you will retain your royal position in the palace." Wait a minute. Where is it? Oh, this is a bad translation. The more common translation is, "And who knows but that you were put in this situation for exactly this purpose." Right? That's why you have this position. So Esther said to respond to Mordecai, "Go and gather all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for my sake. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and
How
day."
is that possible, though? How is that possible to go 3 days
3-day
without?
fast?
You can go 3 days without eating. I don't think you can go 3 days without drinking.
I don't know.
It's a mystery.
I don't know. Maybe they had just enough water not
If
to
anybody
die.
knows an explanation for that,
3 days
put in the
probably
comments.
meant 2 days and an hour type of thing. But at any rate, the whole nation participated in this extended fast. She said, "Do not eat and drink for 3 days, night and day. My maids and I shall also fast in the same way."
I mean, we had a day fast yesterday, which was just from
And we
Sunday.
were whiners.
Oh my God, I can't move. Oh, don't ask me to do anything.
"Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and day. My maids and I shall also fast in the same way. Then I shall go to the king, though it is unlawful. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai transgressed Torah law.
What does that mean?
And did all that Esther had instructed him. What does it mean Mordecai transgressed? He transgressed Torah law by adopting Esther's 3-day fast from the 14th to the 16th of Nisan. It was Pesach
Oh, really?
when they had this fast. That's
You're
how
not supposed to fast.
that's how mortal the danger was to the entire Jewish people. And this is a point that Nina made a few days ago, and it's the most important thing, that whereas the Jews considered themselves, very ensconced and safe in Persian society, and many of them abandoned Torah Judaism. After all, the first temple was destroyed, and they thought, Judaism, that's a thing of the past, old-fashioned, the religion of our fathers and grandfathers. Now we're new modern people in a modern kingdom. And when they were participating in that feast at the beginning of the Megillah, our sages teach that what they were really doing was turning their backs on God. But now that Jew hatred has gone to this total extreme where every single Jew, child, old man, woman, was in mortal danger to all be annihilated on the same day, all the people turned to God and cried out. And that's what made the difference. Chapter 5.
Esther goes to the king. It was on the 3rd day that Esther donned garments of royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing the palace. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the palace, facing the chamber entrance. It happened that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. The king extended the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So I guess you just need to touch that scepter. The king said to her, Paige.
Caroline put in the comments, "Who knows but for such a time as this that you became queen." Exactly. That's the way it's normally translated.
So the king says, "What need do you have, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be granted to you." Wow. Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him." You get more flies with honey, right? Mm-hmm. The king said, "Rush Haman to fulfill Esther's bidding." As high up as Haman was, he wasn't quite at the level of the queen. The king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. At the wine feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your plea? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? Even if it be up to half my kingdom, it shall be done." Esther replied and said, "My plea and my request is this. If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it please the king to grant my plea and fulfill my request, She knew the diplomatic language. Let the king and Haman come to the feast that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I shall fulfill the king's request. On that day, Haman left the king's presence, happy and in good spirits. Ha ha ha! He's getting invited to a private party with the king and queen. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai, once again, neither rose nor showed fear before him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. It wasn't good enough that he was invited to this private party with just the king and queen. He just couldn't take it that this guy he felt was disrespecting him. Haman restrained himself and went to his house. He sent for and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. So his wife, she was a real piece of work. She's an important part of the story. Haman told them of his glorious wealth and his many sons, and about the extent to which the king had promoted him, and how he had raised him above all the king's ministers and servants. Haman said furthermore, Queen Esther invited nobody but me, along with the king, to the feast that she prepared. Page.
Sorry, I'm just banning some individual. Two already have come in there and tried to answer a bunch of comments and start scamming people, but they've been banned from the page.
Oh.
Okay.
Relatives of Haman, perhaps.
Yes.
Descendants of Haman.
Yes.
Although maybe he didn't have any descendants because of what happens later. Tomorrow, too, I invite... Oh, no, he did have descendants.
Well, he's a descendant of Amalek.
No, but he himself...
And Sharon put that in there, that because Saul had not killed the Amalekite king.
But I think there's a teaching that Haman's sons are now Torah scholars in Bnei Brak. Am I imagining that? I feel like I heard that
10 sons
somewhere.
were executed. Maybe there were some others.
Or maybe they had already had sons.
Maybe had grandsons that were not
killed. If
killed.
anybody knows that. Okay, anyway. Tomorrow I am invited to her feast along with the king. Yet all this is worthless to me whenever I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have gallows made 50 cubits high, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Ha ha, that'll do the trick, right? Then you will be able to go happily with the king to the feast. Haman was pleased with the idea, and he made the gallows.
So just remember this Zeresh, the wife, and friends, when he said that nothing, I can't enjoy all my power and, trappings of wealth and power because Mordecai the Jew is sitting at the king's gate. And they say, oh, well, then you should hang him. Okay, let's remember that they said that. Chapter 6. On that night, the king's sleep escaped him. He told his attendants to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had informed on Bigtana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards, who had sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And the king said,
the cracks.
what honor and greatness has been accorded to Mordecai for this? And the king's attendants said, nothing was done for him. And the king said, who of my advisors is in the courtyard? Well, Haman had just come into the outer courtyard of the king's chambers to tell the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows, and he had made for him.
This is such an exciting story. Like, as writers, you can't write it better than this. Just at the moment when he was about to...
And when God is orchestrating things, that's when the coincidences are so extreme. Because God, wants at least the people who look to God, he wants them to know, yeah, it was me. It was me. God is going to keep his hand hidden, but for those who open their eyes, it's like, it's ridiculous, right? How perfect this lines up. And that's what happened. So Haman had just come to see the king to ask him to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had made for him. So the king's attendants said to the king, behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard. And the king said, let him enter. And Haman entered, and the king said to him, what should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for a man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring a royal garment that the king has worn, and a horse upon which the king has ridden, and the royal crown, and let that be placed on the man's head. And let the garment and the horse be entrusted in the hands of one of the king's governing ministers. And let them dress the man who the king wishes to honor. And let them lead him on the horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, so is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. So the king said to Haman, good idea. Hurry, take the garment and the horse and the crown, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. who sits at the king's gate, omit nothing from all that you have spoken. Now, it doesn't say anything about Haman's reaction to when his whole plan is turned on its head. And not only is not going to be given permission to hang Mordecai in the gallows 50 cubits high in his own front yard, but rather he will have to be the one to dress Mordecai, put him on the royal horse, and parade him around Shushan and call out before him. It doesn't record Haman's reaction, but we can imagine it. So Haman took the garment and dressed Mordecai, and he led through the city square and proclaimed before him, "So is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." And Mordecai then returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried to his house in mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends, these are your fair weather wife and friends, about all that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Well, if this Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail over him." Now remember, he had said to them, "It's all worth nothing to me because Mordecai the Jew sits at the king's gate." They knew perfectly well he was Jewish. But now they're saying to him, "Well, come to think of it, if he's Jewish, he's going to destroy you. You will not prevail over him, for you will certainly fall before him." And while they were still talking with him, the chamberlains of the king arrived, and they rushed to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Chapter 7.
Haman's downfall. The king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. Again? Booze. Again on the second day, during the wine feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your plea, Queen Esther? It will be granted you. And what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be done." Queen Esther replied and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me by my plea, and the lives of my people by my request. For my people and I have been sold to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed." I guess the king hadn't realized until that point that she's part of this group.
Of course. She had kept it hidden, as Mordecai told her.
"Had we been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept quiet. I would have kept silent. I'm speaking up because the persecutor is not concerned with the king's loss of manpower and intends to kill us. So very smart. It's not just that you shouldn't kill us because you want it, because you're a nice guy. It's because look at all this servants of the king.
Gonna lose.
You're going to lose a lot. King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is this? And which one is he who has the audacity to do such a thing?" Oh, Esther said, "A man who is a persecutor and an enemy. This evil Haman." Haman was aghast. That's an understatement. Haman was aghast in the presence of the king and the queen. The king arose in his wrath from the wine feast and went to the orchard's garden. And Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life. So that's an interesting scene. Now it's just the two of them in the room because he saw that the king's hostility towards him was determined. Okay, now he's desperate. He's begging this Jewish queen. The king returned from the orchard's garden to the wine feast chamber, and Haman was falling upon the divan upon which Esther was reclining. The king said, "Does he also intend to have his way with the queen while I am in the palace?" So if things weren't already bad enough to Haman, he's now suspected of trying to rape the queen. As soon as these words left the king's mouth, the face of Haman was covered in shame. Harvana, one of the chamberlains who stand before the king, said, "Furthermore, there are the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai." They just sitting there now. "Who spoke up for the king's good and saved him from assassination, standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." So the gallows was actually in his own backyard. The king said, "Hang him upon it." They hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath abated. Now that is what you call revenge. There's,
dig a pit for your enemy and you will fall in it.
Right.
Chapter 8. And a big I should call it to Linda Williams, who made a donation for the poor.
Linda.
Well done, Linda. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, persecutor of the Jews,
all his stuff.
And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king how he was related to her. And the king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. Esther again spoke before the king and fell before his feet, and she cried and beseeched him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot that he had plotted against the Jews. Now you would think Haman's already dead, so his plot against the Jews must be over. But no, because of that communication system.
Right.
The edict had gone out to the 127 provinces.
What is
that
that?
all the Jews would be killed.
The lie gets around the world while the truth is still lacing up his shoes or something.
That's a good saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. People are only too quick to believe explosive lies. Okay, so she begged him to stop this plot against the Jewish people throughout the empire. Now the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor before him, and if the idea is proper before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to all the provinces, ordering them to return the letters containing the plot of Haman, the son of Hamdata the Agagite, who had written instructions to destroy the Jews who lived throughout the king's provinces. For how can I endure and survive while beholding the calamity that will befall my people? And how can I endure and survive while beholding the destruction of my family?" And you see all over the course of the Megillah, right, we're called a race, a tradition, a family, a people, all these different names for the Jews. King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows for raising his hand against the Jews. As for you, write letters concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal them with the king's signet ring, because a letter written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring should not be withdrawn." The king's scribes were then summoned in the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, on its 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai instructed the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 provinces, to each province according to its script, and to each nation according to its language, and to the Jews according to their script and language. Now remember, this is all supposed to happen in Adar, which is now, and they sent out the message in Sivan, which is like last summer, like in June, right? So they had enough time to stop it. And so Mordecai wrote it in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's signet ring. And he sent the letters by couriers who travel speedily on horseback, riders of speedy camels, the B'nai Haramachim. This is that Pony Express. That the king had allowed the Jews of every city to gather and stand up for their lives, to annihilate, kill, and destroy every army of any nation or province that oppresses them, including their children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And copies of the edict were sent to be proclaimed as law in every province, clearly to all the nations, and so that the Jews would be ready for that day to take revenge upon their enemies. And the couriers, the riders of speedy camels, left urgently and hurriedly by order of the king. The law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital. And Mordecai emerged from the king's presence wearing a royal garment of blue and white, a large golden crown, a shawl of fine linen, and a garment of purple wool. And the city of Shushan celebrated and rejoiced. And this we always say at Havdalah. And even when we have a public reading of the Megillah, everyone participates. For the Jews there was light and happiness, joy and glory. And in every province and in every city where the king's edict had reached, there was happiness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Many of the Gentiles converted to Judaism, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Chapter
If you can't beat them, join them.
9. Similar to the Egyptians who left with the children of Israel.
The Jews vanquished their enemies. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, when the time for implementing the king's edict and law had arrived, on the day the enemies of the Jews had thought they would exterminate them, they would dominate them, the situation was reversed and the Jews dominated their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to attack those who sought to harm them. No man stood in their way, for fear of them had fallen upon all the nations. And all the ministers of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's functionaries exalted the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was now the most prominent official in the king's palace, stepping into Haman's role. And his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. People said that the man Mordecai was steadily rising in power. The Jews struck at all their enemies, attacking them with the sword, killing and destroying. They did with their enemies as they wanted. In Shushan, the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as Parshandata. So this is the sons of Haman. Parshandata. So when we read publicly, everybody says this. Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspata, Parata, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, Valsoda, as the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamdata, persecutor of the Jews, but they took none of the spoils. So they could totally have just taken all their stuff, but it wasn't about that. They didn't take their stuff. That day, the number of fatalities in Shushan, the capital, was relayed to the king.
Well, as opposed to Haman's original edict, which was you can kill all the Jews on that day and take their stuff. So it would have been kind of fitting revenge to take the stuff of the enemies, but that's not what they were about.
The king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan, the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the other provinces of the king? What is your plea? It will be granted to you. What is your additional request? It shall be done. Esther replied, if it please the king, let the Jews of Shushan be also allowed to do tomorrow what was lawful today. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows.
Kept hanging, right? That's the idea. They were already hung. They were already dead, but she wants them hung another day. She wants it known that you don't go after the Jews lest this happen to you.
The king ordered this done, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews of Shushan gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Shushan, but took none of the spoils. And the rest of the Jews in the king's province gathered and stood up for their lives to relieve themselves of their enemies. And they killed, 75,000 of their foes, but took none of the spoils. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, they rested on the 14th day and established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. The Jews who were in Shushan gathered on the 13th and the 14th of Adar and rested on the 15th.
That's right. Tomorrow is Shushan Purim.
And so what do we do? Is there any special thing for tomorrow?
Not really.
Sleep off your hangover.
We don't say taken and shul.
And established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. Thus, the Perazi Jews, those who live in cities but are unwalled, make the 14th day of Adar a day of rejoicing, feasting, and a holiday, and the sending of portions of food one to another. So, Israel...
maybe they'd celebrate Purim again tomorrow in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think...
Because that's a walled city. That was walled at that time.
I think they haven't started yet, or...
I'm not sure.
If you're in Israel, let us know what the deal is about. I think it's a little different.
Here we go. Which cities celebrate Purim on the 15th nowadays? The only city that is known to certainly have been walled in the times of Joshua is the old city of Jerusalem. The rest of the city observes on the 15th as well, since it is in the environs of the walled city. So yeah, they're going to do Purim tomorrow.
So our son is going to be studying in yeshiva next year in the old city. But he's American, so which day?
Oh, I don't know.
I'm curious to hear what happens.
That's above my pay grade.
All right. So, and I'm sending of portions of food one to another. Mordecai recorded these events, and basically this, I think, and he sent letters to all the Jews living throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, instructing them to obligate themselves to celebrate annually the 14th for Jews living in unwalled cities, and the 15th for Jews living in walled cities, days of the month of Adar, like the days upon which the Jews rested, having been relieved of their enemies, and the month that had been transformed for them from one of sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity to make them... days of feasting and rejoicing, of the sending of food portions one to another, and gifts to paupers. So that's what we are...
Umatanos levionim. That's what people have been doing. Another Yasher Koach. To Mitch Blumenthal, my good friend, and Judy Grandstrand, who just made gifts. Remember, all donations today flow through us and become gifts to the needy. So we want to raise as much as possible. We'll especially target people with food insecurity.
And the Jews accepted as an obligation that which they had begun to observe voluntarily, and that which Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, persecutor of all the Jews, plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast a pur, which is a lot, to confound them and to destroy them. But when she came before the king, he stated verbally and conveyed with letters to reverse Haman's evil plot against the Jews upon his own head. And he and his sons were hanged upon the gallows. They therefore called these days Purim for the poor, the lottery, and established the holiday and recorded its narrative for posterity because of all the events of this epistle book, which recounts what prompted the characters to act as they did and what happened to them. The Jews established and accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants, that's us, and upon all who might convert to their faith, to annually celebrate these 2 days according to their script on their proper dates, never to be abolished.
Meaning even after Mashiach comes, Purim will still be glowing with light, whereas some of the other holidays will kind of fade in significance. Purim will always be Purim, even in the age of the Messiah.
Will always annually celebrate these 2 days according to their script, they're never to be abolished, and that these days be commemorated and celebrated in every generation, by every family, in every province, in every city, and that these days of Purim will never depart from among the Jews, nor will their commemoration cease from their descendants. Purim is established and the book of Esther is canonized. The next year, Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail and Mordecai the Jew, wrote about the enormity of all the aspects of the miracle to establish the holiday with this second Purim epistle. I don't know how to pronounce it.
I say epistle.
Epistle.
I'm probably wrong.
It's one of those words I've seen but I've never said. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of Ahasuerus's kingdom, words of peace and truth, instructing them to obligate themselves to observe these days of Purim on their proper dates in the manner that Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, just as they had accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants the observance of the fasts and their lamentations. And that's very much how Judaism works. Like, things have been accepted on behalf of us. So you might come along and be like, well, I'm Jewish, but I never signed up for this. Yeah, but your ancestors already signed you up.
You enjoy the benefits, you enjoy
like
the
it or
obligations.
not, you've already been signed up. And the request of Esther confirmed the aspect of these Purim days, and the story was included in Scripture. And I believe it is the last book of the Hebrew Bible.
That was added?
No.
I mean, I don't know, right? Because you figure Ezra was chronologically later.
Okay.
After the second temple was
they
built
came
and
back,
the exiles
right.
returned. But it was definitely a late addition to Scripture.
Late addition. Late breaking news.
Mordecai becomes viceroy. Chapter 10, very short chapter, so we're almost at the end. Again, the link is in the comments on both Facebook and YouTube. If you want to make a donation today to the poor, Matanios
And if you're
Levyonim.
watching this after it's live, go ahead, please,
go
donations
ahead.
are welcome.
And everything donated today will go through us to the poor. Okay, chapter 10. Achashverosh levied a tax upon the mainland and the islands of the sea. And the entire history of his power and strength and the story behind Mordecai's prominence, having been promoted by the king, are recorded in the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, a respected leader to the Jews, and he was found favorable by a majority of his brethren. Not everybody.
So typical. So you might have heard the expression, 2 Jews, 3 opinions.
Exactly.
This guy, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. He spoke 7 languages. He
Most
was
powerful man ever.
instrumental
Saved
in
all the
saving
Jews.
his entire people. And there's some guys, well, not impressed.
Not impressed. Maybe he should just go back to the Sanhedrin, not be so involved in
He
government.
was found favorable. You would have thought it would say he was found favorable by his people.
Yes.
Nope.
By majority of his brethren.
You can't please everybody when it comes to Jews.
But the last sentence of the Megillah and the last sentence about Mordecai, what do we remember him for? Not his wealth, not his power, not his learning, not him being head of the head of Sanhedrin or, second only to the emperor of the biggest empire ever. But the last sentence is he sought goodness for his people and spoke peacefully with all his children. Thus concludes the Megillah.
Well, thank you for going through this roller coaster of a story with us. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
It's Karen saying, I'd like to know more about which holidays continue post-Mashiach and which would not and why. Any recommended reading for this?
I mean, there's definitely
You can Google that question, and there's definitely some articles on
Some
Chabad.
say that Hanukkah is also included in that category.
Some say that, but definitely, like the Vilna Gaon taught that Purim and Yom Kippur are actually two halves of the same holiday, right? So even after Mashiach comes, Yom Kippur will remain, and the temple will have been erected so that the high priest can serve in the temple. And, perhaps we'll still need to atone for the mistakes we make even after Mashiach comes. But the other holidays, which, a lot of them is looking forward, to the redemption. And once the redemption has come, those holidays, I've heard it likened to, they're going to look like a candle flame next to a bonfire. And that's why their significance will pale. But the significance of Purim will not.
Like every day
I believe
will be a
Yom Kippur
holiday in those
will
days.
not. And Shabbos will always be Shabbos. But you can definitely Google that question and look for an article at Chabad.
And there's probably a difference of opinion about
Also,
that issue.
big Yashikok to Marcella, who just
Thank you,
donated
Marcella.
for the poor.
Yay.
And like Nina said, for the rest of the day, any donations that come in will go to that fund. My friends, it's wonderful doing this annual tradition with you of Nina and I reading the Megillah in English with a little bit of commentary. And may you all be blessed with a sweet, sweet Freilichen Purim for you and all your loved ones. And may the light of this holiday permeate not only the day, not only this moment, not only your eyes, but all your days and all your ways for all your loved ones. Sending you big love
Amen.
from LA on Purim.
Let's just smile for the camera so that we can get a screenshot for when we post this. Because sometimes I'm looking for a screenshot and it's like one of us is always reading and the other one, so it's good to get
so
that.
I'm going to end the YouTube.